Well, welcome to the program, David. It's great to have you here.
Likewise, pleasure to be here.
I always start by asking, what brought you to Treasury and why did you choose Treasury as your career?
That's a good question. So the reality is I didn't. I really have spent a long time, in fact, probably my whole career in and around the Treasury space. Started in commercial banking. I was in corporate banking and investment banking for many years. And really everything I was doing involved dealing with either a treasurer or a CFO in my banking career. So I was advising them, I was covering them from a relationship perspective, negotiating with them, whether that was as a coverage officer, product specialist, or a country manager. But it wasn't until just over a year ago that I actually became a treasurer for the first time. So I would say I didn't choose Treasury as a career, and I think that's probably something I've heard from many of your other guests as well on previous podcasts. But I've ended up in Treasury, having been hanging around the Treasury space for probably most of my banking career before I came into Treasury last year.
So just to give the listeners a quick snapshot of your background, as you say, you started in banking. So even within the really niche part of the funding side of securitization, so it was Barclays, Bank of America, Mizuho, and RBS. You did some consulting in Barbados, and then back into the funding side with Finicity, and now most recently with Terex, where you're now the group treasurer.
Correct.
Can I just ask you, how did you find those international moves? Like you've worked in the UK, you've worked in Asia, Barbados, the US. Being an international citizen is not always easy. What's your advice and I guess your experiences in being that international citizen?
I really consider myself to be a citizen of the world. I started in the UK, as you said. I've spent time in the Americas, in the US and Barbados. I spent time in Asia in Qatar as well. And my recommendation to anyone who has the opportunity is to take it with open arms. Clearly in the situation we're in today, it's not quite so easy to travel. But anyone who has the opportunity to travel internationally, work internationally, I think it's critical. And I think that it's been beneficial not only to me in my career, but it's certainly been beneficial to my family as well. I think we've all considered ourselves to become citizens of the world. And the world becomes a much smaller place when you have that diversity of experience. And you can work your way around and being very culturally sensitive to everything you do. And that's very important given the globalization of the world today.
And I think it just teaches you, I always say, it teaches you emotional intelligence in that cultural differences are slight, but very big. So it doesn't feel like it's a massive difference in a lot of things, but the end result and how you need to deal with people really are. And that's about emotional intelligence, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, when I first moved, when I moved from the UK to the US, I was offered cultural training. At the time, I didn't have time. I had a young family. I was literally trying to move my young family at very short notice from the UK to the US, was offered cultural training, didn't necessarily see the value in it, given that I didn't see a massive difference in the culture between the UK and the US. But when I was moved to the Middle East, I actually asked for the cultural training because I felt that it was necessary and it wasn't available. So we had to figure our own way through the world at that point. But yeah, absolutely. It's emotional intelligence is a critical piece or armor that a treasurer or anyone working internationally needs to be able to negotiate and work their way around the world.
What would you say have been some of the highlights, David, of your career so far in your mind?
Well, as I said, having had the opportunity to work and travel internationally, unquestionably, I've not only enjoyed that, but I think it's really helped my career over the years. I would say, some of the highlights really involve some of the unusual transactions that I've been involved with through my career. Very early in my securitization career, we worked on a transaction where a client had come to us and said, we have a working capital issue. We just won a contract to build Apache helicopters under license for the UK Ministry of Defence. It's going to create us a working capital problem. Can you find a solution that would solve the the working capital issue for us. And so we worked on a transaction for them. It ended up solving that working capital, getting off-balance sheet financing for them. In the end, they used that to negotiate themselves a better deal with the Ministry of Defense, so the deal didn't happen. But it was the first taste that I had early in my career about really unusual transactions. I worked on a deal for Norwich Union, which then became Aviva, where we helped to solve the new business strain issues that they had with their regulator at the time. So I always described it as my most and least successful transaction all in one go. We effectively created something that solved the capital problems that they had with their regulator at that time. We won a second mandate actually from another UK life insurer at the same time. And ultimately that was used to change the regulatory capital rules in the UK such that it was no longer necessary to do a securitization. So we did the transaction, we completely changed the landscape, but then killed the business that we created in the first place. We worked on some very unusual inventory securitizations. And I guess, when we were in the US, we also ended up doing extended auto loan deals for some of the major auto companies. As you can imagine, securitization involves eligibility criteria, and there are many transactions or loans that fall out of the eligibility criteria. And these things can accumulate. In this case, the customer of ours had $5 billion worth of these ineligible assets. And we figured out a way to securitize something that had never been done before. So I would say if there's a common theme to all of this, it's problem solving. It's figuring out a way in many different jurisdictions to find a solution to a problem. And those are really the highlights. That's what I've really enjoyed most of all, is being presented with an issue and then finding, a way to solve that very complex issue, often involving some heavy structuring along the way.
David, how do you find the differences between that banking securitization time and now your corporate treasury time with Terex?
Well, I would say there is no way that I could have walked into this role without that background. And I think what was really important from my perspective was not just having the very specific experience in the structured finance world. I mean, that was very important and very valuable, and it gave me that problem solving capability. But if I hadn't had that broad corporate banking experience prior to doing my securitization roles, I don't think I would have had the breadth of experience that I've got to be able to do a treasury role well. And so I think it was the combination of that broad experience in the corporate banking world, particularly as a coverage officer or a relationship officer for a bank, combined with the structured finance discipline, that problem solving discipline. That combination enabled me to be prepared to become a treasurer, later in my career. But if I hadn't had that broader experience, I don't think I would have been able to do this role. And I read extensively. One of the things I'm always keen on is pushing myself, learning new things, being a lifelong learner. So I read a lot of books, and I read a book recently called Range by a guy called David Epstein, and it was actually recommended to me by a colleague of mine. And he said, "I think you'll enjoy this book," because I think it was a great book, and I agreed with him. It was a fantastic book. But he said, "As I read this, I saw you in this book." And he said, I saw how the guy talks about this broad range of skills being so important for people as they develop their career. And the whole sort of concept is taking the one extreme, which is the Tiger Woods, who, as everybody knows, he could pick up a putter at 9 months and he could swing a club at 2 years. Everybody thinks that to become a Tiger Woods, you have to have that early dedication and experience that's very focused on one particular discipline. And what David Epstein says is that, you don't necessarily need that. That isn't the only path to success. And in fact, people like Roger Federer, who is a very successful tennis player, being number one in the world for many years, he wasn't a specialist in tennis until his early teens. His mother was a tennis coach. She refused to coach him. he played every sport that imaginable that involved a ball, but he wasn't a specialist tennis player until his early teens. And he did very well. So his argument is that you can have that broad range of skills, and it helps you to develop analogies that can be then used in other parts of your career as that career develops. And that's certainly been the experience that I've had.
Moving around internationally, David, obviously networking is an important thing when you go to new countries. What's been your approach to networking over your career?
It's critical. I mean, it's absolutely critical. I remember when LinkedIn was first created. I was at RBS in the US at the time. And I remember I got my first LinkedIn invitation. And I remember thinking, why does this guy want to connect with me? I know who he is. I've got his contact details. He's got my contact details. I speak to him every day. Why do we need to connect through LinkedIn? So I was initially sort of dismissive of the value of that platform. But one thing I've realized, and RBS has had its challenges over the years, and it was rescued by the UK government at one point. And as a result, many of the people I worked with, they've all scattered around the world to many different companies and different industries. And having maintained that network of people through LinkedIn, because you often lose track of where people go, it's been really important, because you never know. You never know when you might need to speak to somebody about a particular opportunity, whether you can help them. And, I ended up taking this job. I'm a firm believer that what goes around comes around. And that's really what happened when I ended up moving to Terex 4 years ago. It was a colleague of mine. He was a regulatory capital advisor that we had at RBS. He knew he was leaving the company, was looking for advice in terms of what company to choose to go to. And he reached out to me one day and said, hey, would you mind meeting for lunch? I just want to pick your brains in terms of where to go and what I should be thinking about. And, I said to him at the time, if you think about banking today, if there's any part of banking that's growing right now, it's regulation. It's the regulatory capital side of the business. And so I think you should be very confident about the different opportunities that could come your way from this. And so, I gave him what I thought was genuine, fair advice. Very soon afterwards, and I don't think it was anything that I'd said to him, but very soon afterwards, he ended up landing a great job at a hedge fund, and is now actually working for that hedge fund, and is now the CFO of one of their businesses in Singapore. But 2 months after that meeting for lunch, he called me and said, I've just taken a call from a headhunter. There's a great opportunity that Terex has for running the capital markets for the captive finance company that we have. I think it's the perfect role for you. I've given your contact details to that headhunter, and they're going to reach out to you. And they did. And that's how I ended up moving to Terex. So, I'm a firm believer that, and of course, I didn't meet the guy for lunch because I thought I was going to get an opportunity, but I'm a firm believer that if you reach out to your network to help them, that at some point it'll benefit you in the long run. So keeping and maintaining and building that network is really important. And I can't stress that enough to people who are in the Treasury world or emerging into the Treasury world. It's really important to build and maintain your network.
And in a way, David, you've hit the nail on the head there. Like I have a saying that I often put on the program, that my approach to building relationships or networking, because I do believe that networking is about building relationships. And to me, if you go into a transaction of meeting someone with a view that what can you do for them rather than what can they do for you, you're going to be a far more successful networker. Because I think if you pay it forward like that, you're not going in with an expectation, but you're a great example of, you went into that conversation to help someone else and you land the job that you really wanted 2-3 months later. So that just backs up my theory there. Whereas I think a lot of people, particularly the younger folks out there, go into network thinking, okay, I need to talk to X because they can get me Y. Right. And when you're going into it like that, it's not building a relationship. It's a take scenario. And right. I don't think that's as successful.
No, I think, like I said, there've been many examples over the years where I've tried to help people advise them, guide them. And even recently, I've referred somebody to you who I thought was a great fit for something that you were advertising, not because I expected to get anything from it, and simply because I could connect the dots between what you were looking for, the skill set that I knew somebody had, and it takes 5 minutes. Just literally, you put a call together or an email together, and it takes 5 minutes to connect people, and it makes you feel good too. So you do that, and you never know. Sometimes it comes back to benefit you as well later on, but that's not the purpose of doing it. It's helping others, and eventually they may help you.
And that also just shows me, it really demonstrates to me how small the world is now, David, because that was someone you worked with in the UK. We're talking now because of your role in the US, and that person's back in Sydney, which is where I obviously live. And for the listeners out there, she's actually at reference stage for that role as well. So it was a very good connection.
I didn't realize that.
Yes. So it just shows you and the power of LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn is also bringing all of that to be a lot smaller. It used to be you had to be in a geography, and when you were making your initial moves, it would have been really hard to get to meet people in those new geographies. Whereas now, I think the social media tools and the world just gets smaller. So all of that is just much, much easier now. That there's no real excuse for people to not be able to build relationships successfully.
No. And I think that, again, if you've built that solid base and that solid network in the first place, people do move. And they not only move companies, but they move geographies as well. And so before you know it, you might have started with a cluster of people that in a particular area. But gradually these people, they grow, their careers grow, they move internationally potentially. And then all of a sudden, your network just feeds on itself. So, and again, I've been fortunate, I've been very lucky to have had the opportunity to live and work in many different jurisdictions. So that sort of helped to accelerate the internationalization of that network. But again, building and maintaining a network is important, and having those international connections is particularly important, especially if you want to expose yourself to the different cultures and the emotional intelligence that we talked about earlier.
David, have mentors played a part in your career?
Yes. One in particular I can think of very early in my career when I was at Barclays. He was my manager at the time. He had actually spent some time in a training role at Barclays. I was in corporate banking at that time, sort of very focused on credit and thinking that credit was the future for my career. And interestingly, and this is how I almost ended up in securitization in the first place, was there was a job that had been advertised in the investment bank at Barclays de Zoete Wed, as it was in the old days before it became Barclays Capital. And it was a credit job in the securitization group. And this is my dream opportunity. This is what I wanted to do. And for a variety of reasons, the meetings just never happened. They set up an interview, and then all of a sudden they were traveling to Stockholm or Hamburg or wherever. And the meetings just, for whatever reason, didn't materialize. And my boss at the time came to me and said, I think you would benefit from going into the training world. I spent several years in training myself, and I think it would be beneficial to you. And I said, that would be the last thing I would imagine. If I stood up in front of anyone at that young age, and I did move around quite a bit when I was in my early stage of my banking career at Barclays. Whenever I had to give a leaving speech, literally my legs would shake with fear, because I just was not capable of presenting to a group of people. And I said to him, that's the worst thing I could imagine myself doing. Why on earth would I go from what I think is my dream opportunity in credit and securitization and do a training job when I'm actually useless at presenting to people? And he said, and that's the reason why you should do this.
Yeah, exactly.
He said,
right.
You spend time getting out of your comfort zone, really working hard on probably the biggest weakness that you have. It'll pay dividends for you in the long run. So I eventually took his advice. I did 2 years in that training job. So I was, writing and designing training programs for large corporate analysis for the bank, but at the same time presenting these things as well. And I don't think I was very good at it, but it gave me that confidence and that ability to stand in front of an audience that has stood me so well for so long. And the irony is that right at the end of my stint in training, I called the guy who was running the securitization group at that time and said, I don't know if you remember me, but 2 years ago, you were supposed to interview me for a job. For some reason, that never happened because, the meetings never occurred. But I'm just about to finish my training job now, and I'd like to speak to you. And he said, it's your lucky day. He said, 2 people just resigned this week. Come and see me. And that's how I ended up in securitization.
Wow. And timing's everything, right? That's another thing. You can never bank on that. It's just making the calls and talking to people, and timing just works out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, especially to the younger audience, don't be afraid to ask. And that was how I ended up with a 20-year career in structured finance, was off the back of one phone call. And again, you got to be careful. You can't overplay your hand, but equally, if you don't ask, you don't get. And if I hadn't made that phone call, I would not be here today doing this job.
I mean, that leads in really well to, what's the best advice you wish you'd been told when you were starting your career that you know today?
Well, I mean, we talked about network, and again, I think it's really important to build and maintain a network. I would say be a lifelong learner. I think I went through a phase, especially through my structured finance career, where I lost that curiosity. I mean, I was doing a very technical, difficult job, and I was never really had the time or the energy to do anything other than that job. But over the years, I've tried, other than that, to maintain that intellectual curiosity, that being a lifelong learner, reading, exploring, challenging myself. So that's critical. Get outside your comfort zone. I mean, I did it in that training job. I did it when I picked up the phone and asked the guy if I could move into securitization from the training role. One other thing I would say that's very important for people is learn how to tell a good story, and learn how to tell a good corporate story. The number of times that I come across people who they know their stuff, they're technically very able, and they're actually doing a very good job. But if you give them 30 seconds or 60 seconds to explain a particular opportunity or transaction, it's amazing how difficult some people can find that to be. And so, there's plenty of material out there, there's plenty of books out there that talk about telling a good corporate story. I wish I'd learned that earlier in my career, because when you're in that elevator with your boss and he says, how's that project coming along? It sounds crass, but unless you can explain in 30 or 60 seconds, that opportunity is gone. So again, I think, if I'd learned that earlier in my career, it would have benefited me a lot, I'm sure.
I hear that a lot, David. I think that's a really important point to just stress for the listeners out there, is the difference between, you can get to a certain level in an organization, but once you're at the sort of the senior end, so in this world, like once you're the treasurer, you don't have 5 minutes to talk to the board, to the CFO, to the CEO. You've got 30 seconds. Now, it's a given that your subject matter that you're a subject matter expert. But what you need to be able to do is then explain it in the simplest way that is a complex situation, and you've only got a short amount of time, and you've got to know your stuff to be able to do that, and be able to, as David said, have the ability to just tell that story very quickly, because that's all those people want to know. They just want to know that you know what you're talking about it, and you can deliver it quickly.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think, if you're presenting to the board, or you're presenting, say, to a subcommittee of the board, they want to hear something that they've asked you a very specific question. You got to be able to answer them cover all the bases. You got to be able to explain very quickly and in great detail. But it takes a real skill to be able to do that. And again, it's I found it's something that I've learned over many years. But the earlier that people can master that in their career, the better, because it will pay dividends big time.
Definitely. What about when you're hiring then, David? What are the key things you look for in your direct hires?
I mean, it goes without question that obviously the technical skills are important. So if you're hiring into a treasury function, somebody, if they have to have the strong technical skills for whichever part of treasury that you're focused on, whether it's cash management, trade finance, capital markets, or risk management. They obviously have to have those technical skills. They need to be a strategic thinker. Again, I really look for people who can connect the dots between the different parts of the business and understand that what they do has implications for other parts of the business as well. I would say that given my background, I look for problem solvers. I look for people who can take a challenging problem and find a solution to that problem without necessarily any previous experience of it. And again, analogies, as I was describing earlier, are very important. Being able to take a skill set that you've learned from one area, whether it's within treasury or somewhere else, and applying it to the treasury problem that you're dealing with. I mean, just as an example, when I started at Terex, one of the things we were very focused on was the captive finance company that we're responsible for was taking out as much of the invested capital from that business as we could. And if you think about it, we were sort of applying lean principles, which predominantly are used in manufacturing. It's sort of shrinking the inventory in a manufacturing plant that then exposes the other issues that you have to address. We really applied that lean thinking to the captive finance company to be able to shrink the inventory, shrink the invested capital in the business, redeploy that capital elsewhere in the company, but at the same time, expose other issues that we have to then address because the inventory has been reduced. And when you have a lot of inventory or when you have a lot of invested capital in a business, that tends to hide other things that need to be fixed. And you can't see those things until that capital is removed. So I think somebody who can take a complex problem from maybe a completely different discipline and use it and apply it in the treasury world, that's something I often look for. Telling a story, again, it's being able to tell the story succinctly in a very short presentation to somebody is important. And then the other thing, when I'm thinking about hiring people, as I'm interviewing them, I'm trying to picture them in front of the CFO. I'm trying to picture them, okay, if this person has 1 minute in front of the CFO in the boardroom and they're asked a question, how are they going to cope with this? How will they respond? Will they respond in a way that gives the CFO confidence and comfort that they know what they're doing, or are they going to flounder? And I think, again, it all comes back to this ability to tell the story with poise. And it goes without question that you expect people to know their stuff and be technically able. It's whether they can convey that to others with a degree of confidence.
100%. Yeah, I think that's really a super important skill to have. What do you think makes a successful treasurer in the eyes of the CFO, the CEO, the board?
Well, in any circumstance, managing liquidity, but especially in today's world, I mean, liquidity, cash is always king, but especially in a pandemic. So having the right tools to manage liquidity and keep control of liquidity are always important, but especially important right now. And many companies are making sure that they've got more than enough liquidity to manage their way through the current virus. I think being strategic, in the same way that I would look to hire people into my team who are strategic, a good treasurer has to be strategic. A good treasurer has to have the ability to connect all of the dots. And again, connect everything that they're doing and prove to the CFO or the CEO that they understand every moving part of what's going on and the implications for the company. I've always maintained with my CFO that, and the first thing I said to him when I took this role was that I think it's up to me to create optionality for you. It's up to me to create those opportunities and bring those opportunities to you that are going to really make a difference to the company. And between us, we'll figure out whether they make sense or not. But I really have to come to you with the ideas and create that optionality. And I would say finally, it's probably thinking ahead. It's anticipating issues. I mean, nobody could have seen this COVID situation, obviously, but it's thinking 12, 18 months, 24 months down the line, not solving just today's problems, but figuring out what's next, and thinking ahead so that things don't just come up and bite you when you least expect them.
One last question for you, David. Technology is changing very quickly. How do you see the role of the Treasurer changing in the coming years?
I think there's going to be continued improvement in efficiencies in Treasury. I think a lot of the technology that's available and is now being accelerated, I think, by the pandemic, is going to accelerate the rollout of some of this technology, and that's going to drive efficiencies probably for the sort of lower end of the Treasury function. So payment systems, I think there are many disruptive business models in the banking world which are going to have an impact. Robotics are coming into certain parts of what we do now. But I think, realistically, I think they'll change some of the more mundane tasks in the Treasury world, but there's no real substitute for having a strong Treasury team that has all the skills and the attributes that I was talking about earlier. That technically they're very able, strategically they're able to connect all the dots, and finally that they're able to convey that with confidence to the outside world, whether it's the accounting team, the tax team, or the CFO and the CEO. It's really being able to convey the strength and the knowledge and the skills that they have. The technology will improve efficiency, but it won't fundamentally change what Treasury does.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it'd be good to get rid of some of that mundane to really then focus on the value add and the business partnering for sure. David, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed our chat today, and I look forward to chatting with you again.
I appreciate it, and thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you, Simon.
Hello and welcome to the Treasury Talent Podcast. I'm your host, Simon Lynch. Today I am joined on the podcast